The city pulsed with its usual rhythm, blaring horns, hurried steps, the blur of lives rushing by. It was a sharp, early winter afternoon in central London, where cold crept between stone buildings and settled into the bones of those who had nowhere to hide. On the heated terrace of a luxury cafe off Piccadilly, life felt almost untouched. The world outside moved on, but inside that little bubble, everything slowed. Edward Blake, just turned 33, sat at a corner table dressed in quiet perfection. From his crisp wool coat to the gleam of his leather brogues, he looked like a man who had everything figured out. Tech millionaire, investor, media darling. But his espresso sat untouched. He wasn't there for the coffee, he was chasing silence. The kind that only came when the world around you kept moving, but you didn't. Then came a voice, small, fragile, and shaking. "Please, sir, just 10 pounds. Startled, Edward looked down. A young boy, no older than 4, stood before him, clutching a rag in one tiny hand. His coat was threadbare, trainers far too big, cheeks red from the cold. "I can shine your shoes," the boy said bravely, lifting his chin. "I don't want charity, I just need to buy bread for my mum." Edward blinked, unsure if it was a scam or sincerity. But when he followed the boy's trembling finger to the figure huddled across the street, barely more than a girl herself slumped in the shadow of a shopfront, he felt something stir. She looked broken, not loud, not begging, just still, cold, alone. What followed was not a rescue, not at first. It was a reckoning, a quiet collapse of the wall Edward had built between himself and the world. A boy named Noah, a mother called Grace, and a desperate plea for something far deeper than money. That moment would become the turning point, a point where success no longer masked loneliness, where compassion cracked open a heart that had gone silent. This isn't just a story about poverty or wealth, it's about dignity, and how the simple request of a child can unravel a lifetime of detachment. Because sometimes the most powerful stories don't begin with grand declarations. They begin with a whisper in the cold, and a single 10 pounds plea that changed everything. Noah led Edward across the road with surprising urgency for a child his size, his worn-out trainers slipping slightly on the icy pavement. London's city buzz continued behind them, people sipping lattes, chatting on mobiles, heads down in scarves, but none of them stopped to notice the woman slumped beside a bench dusted with frost. She was barely upright, crumpled against the concrete like a forgotten coat. Her arms curled instinctively around her chest, her hair tangled across her face. A young woman, Grace, as Noah had softly called her, looked more like a teenager than a mother, her coat fraying at the edges, her lips tinged blue. One of her shoes was missing. Edward stopped a foot away. He hadn't touched this kind of pain in years, not since Claire, not since the day the sirens never brought her back. He was used to figures like this as background blur from the backseat of a taxi, not flesh and bone before him, not someone's daughter, someone's mother. Noah crouched beside her and placed a tiny hand on her arm. "Mom, I found someone. He's kind. He said he'll help." At the boy's touch, Grace stirred, barely. A low groan escaped her lips. Her body was paper-thin, light as air, her dress torn and soaked at the hem. Her hand found Noah's, instinctively gripping it. Not out of desperation, but something fiercer, protective. Even unconscious, she refused to let go. Edward acted without thinking. He pulled off his own coat, a dark wool number worth more than most rent, and wrapped it around her. When she began to slump again, he caught her, her body weightless in his arms. He looked at Noah. "We're taking her somewhere warm." A black cab rolled to the curb within minutes, its engine purring against the cold. "Prescott Urgent Care," Edward instructed the driver, offering triple fare. He climbed in with Grace in his arms, Noah seated opposite, never letting go of his mom's hand. "Is she going to die?" the boy asked softly. Edward met his gaze. "Not if I can help it." At the clinic, the nurses were waiting. As Edward carried Grace through the sliding doors, her pale head resting against his shoulder, passers-by stopped and stared. Not because she looked out of place, but because he did. A man in tailored trousers and scuffed shoes, carrying a woman who had clearly lived rough. No press release, no PR stunt, just an ache that had finally cracked through a lifetime of distance. Inside, the warmth hit them like a wave. The medical team rushed Grace onto a stretcher, wrapping her in blankets. "Severe hypothermia, malnourishment," a nurse noted quickly. Check the child too, he looks underweight. Noah clutched Edward's hand then, his fingers ice cold but determined. You're staying, right? He asked, and Edward, without knowing why, nodded. Of course. The hours passed slowly. Edward sat in the waiting area, a coffee cooling untouched in his hands. When Grace awoke, she panicked at first, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar white walls. But Edward was there. He's safe, he said gently, nodding toward Noah, now sleeping under a hospital blanket on a nearby couch. She looked at him, suspicion flickering in her tired eyes. Why are you helping us? He didn't offer a rehearsed answer. He simply said, because I can. Grace fell silent, eyes welling, then whispered, people don't just help like that. Not here. Edward understood. He had walked past people like her for years. That night, watching her cradle her son as he snored into her coat, he saw what real strength looked like. Not the boardroom variety, the kind that endures quietly with scraped knees and empty pockets. The next morning, Grace sat up slowly in the hospital bed, IV still in her arm. I used to study psychology, she said suddenly, her voice hoarse. Top of my class. I wanted to open a center for kids with trauma. Then, I fell in love. He vanished when I told him I was pregnant. My family said I'd ruined everything. Edward didn't speak. He didn't need to. She continued. We slept in churches, train stations, anywhere. I worked cleaning jobs, odd shifts. Just one more day, one more quid. I told myself that. So long as Noah was warm, had bread, it was worth it. And in that moment, Edward knew. This wasn't about charity. It was about dignity. About a mother who'd sacrificed everything, yet still stood taller than most he'd ever known. Something in him shifted again, and he quietly resolved. He wouldn't walk past this story. Not this time. The hospital room hummed quietly, filled with the faint scent of antiseptic and the steady beeping of machines. Grace stirred beneath a pale blue blanket, her limbs heavy, her breath labored. For a moment she didn't recognize where she was. All she could feel was the hollowness in her stomach and the overwhelming urge to find her son. Noah, she gasped, trying to sit up, her body protesting the effort. Panic bloomed in her chest until a voice answered, calm and steady. He's safe. He's right outside. Startled, she turned her head to find Edward seated beside her bed. He looked out of place in the sterile environment, too well put together, too composed. But there was no arrogance in his presence, just a strange kind of quiet reassurance. She eyed him cautiously, her voice hoarse. Are you with the council? He shook his head. I'm just someone who saw your boy trying to shine shoes for 10 pounds so he could buy you bread. The words landed like a blow. Grace's breath caught as she struggled to comprehend the reality unfolding around her. Edward leaned back slightly, giving her space. I followed him. Found you. You'd passed out from hunger. I called the ambulance. That's all. Grace gripped the blanket tighter, her eyes narrowing. Why would you help us? She asked. Her tone was not unkind, just exhausted, wary. He met her gaze without blinking. Because I could. She exhaled, half a bitter laugh, half disbelief. People don't do that, not here. I know, Edward replied softly. But your son? He looked at me like I was the only hope he had left. Silence stretched between them, thick, still, not uncomfortable. Grace looked away, ashamed. We hadn't eaten in 2 days. I gave him everything I had, just needed to make sure he had something warm in his belly. Edward nodded, his voice even. You nearly didn't wake up. Her eyes welled, but she blinked the tears away. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I had a plan once. I was at university, studied psychology, top of my year. She paused as though remembering a different version of herself. I wanted to open a trauma center for kids, children like Noah. I interned at a shelter during my final year. What happened? Edward asked, his tone gentle, never pushing. I fell in love, Grace said with a bitter smile. He was older, charming, said all the right things, promised me the world. When I told him I was pregnant, he disappeared. No calls, nothing. She wiped at her eyes, this time not bothering to hide the tears. When I told my parents, they didn't even shout. They just looked at me like I was already gone. Said I'd ruined everything, said I had to leave. Edward remained silent, giving her the dignity of her truth. Grace continued, voice steadier now, not from confidence but from raw necessity. I tried the shelters, most were full. Others weren't safe. So we kept moving. I took cleaning jobs, odd shifts. Sometimes we slept in train stations, sometimes in church pews. Noah always thought it was an adventure. I told myself, one more day, one more pound. If he had food and warmth, it was worth it. Edward's chest tightened. She was barely more than a girl, but her strength eclipsed every boardroom leader he'd ever known. "You don't need to apologize," he said at last. "You did what you had to." She gave a small, tired smile. "I'm not ashamed of being a mom, just tired of being invisible." They sat like that for a while, two strangers who weren't really strangers at all. Grace clinging to what little she had left. Edward, quietly grieving a love he'd buried years ago. In her presence, something long dormant stirred within him. Not pity, something more powerful. Respect, admiration, and maybe the first sparks of something deeper. Then, from the hallway, a small voice echoed, "Mom!" Noah ran into the room, a paper bag clutched proudly in his hands. "They gave me real bread," he grinned, eyes wide with joy. Grace pulled him into her arms, kissing his curls. "You saved me some?" she asked, voice cracking. He nodded solemnly, opening the bag to reveal half a sandwich. "The best bit, just for you." As she took the bread with trembling hands, a quiet sob broke from her lips. She turned away slightly, shielding her face, but the tears wouldn't stop. Noah looked at her with wide, uncertain eyes. "Mommy, it's okay. We're safe now." Edward turned away to give them privacy, but in that small room, amidst grief and healing, something sacred began to bloom. That first night in Edward's guest flat, Grace barely slept. Not from discomfort. It was the warmest, safest place she'd laid her head in months, but because her body didn't know how to relax anymore. She lay still on the edge of the bed, listening to Noah's soft breathing beside her, the unfamiliar hum of a refrigerator, the ticking of a clock on the wall. Everything was still. Stillness had become the hardest thing to endure. It was in silence that the memories crept in. Nights on benches with her son curled beneath her coat, mornings searching bins behind bakeries, the sting of strangers' glances that never quite met her eyes. By morning, she'd already cleaned the bathroom, wiped down every surface, and folded their few belongings. She didn't want Edward to think they were taking advantage. She never wanted to be a burden. So when he knocked on the door with a bag of groceries and an awkward smile, she was already trying to find a way to thank him without it sounding like surrender. Over the next few days, she remained cautious, grateful but guarded. She cooked small meals with the food he'd left, always saving the best portions for Noah. She refused any money. When Edward offered her a spare jumper for the boy, she accepted with a polite nod, folding it with care as if it were silk. She didn't want charity. She wanted dignity. Edward, to his credit, never made her feel small. He didn't pry, didn't patronize, he simply appeared, sometimes with books for Noah, sometimes with questions about her past that felt more like interest than interrogation. And slowly, almost without noticing, Grace found herself softening. She started sitting with him over tea after dinner, not always speaking, but not afraid to be seen either. She'd laugh, quietly at first, at something Noah said, and Edward would look up from his cup, not saying a word, just watching her as if that laugh was the rarest thing in the world. One evening, he brought home a worn paperback. "My mom's favorite," he said simply, holding it out to her. Inside was a note scribbled in firm, neat handwriting. "You deserve more than survival. You deserve to be seen, heard, and loved." Grace stared at the words for a long time, unable to stop the tears from falling, not because they made her feel weak, but because for the first time in years, she felt human again. She didn't trust the feeling at first. Hope, for her, had always been a dangerous thing. But in the quiet rhythms of that little flat, in the way Edward listened, the way he played cards with Noah without looking bored, the way he let her lead, something began to settle inside her. She was no longer surviving day to day. She was starting ever so gently to heal. Edward noticed it in the little things, how she tucked Noah's drawings on the fridge, how she insisted on folding his laundry if he left it out, how she smiled with her whole face when Noah handed her a crumpled dandelion from the park. He didn't tell her he noticed. He just kept showing up. There was one night in particular that changed everything. He returned late from work, expecting the flat to be dark, but instead found it glowing with soft light. Grace was sitting on the floor, legs crossed, sock puppets on her hands, spinning a ridiculous story about a boy who saved the world with kindness. Noah was giggling uncontrollably, draped in a blanket like a superhero cape. Edward didn't enter the room. He just watched from the doorway, watched as Grace, still in borrowed clothes, hair tied back in a loose bun, transformed that little lounge into something sacred. She looked up mid-story and caught him standing there. Their eyes met. No words were exchanged. None were needed. For the first time in years, Edward felt home. That night, he lay awake in his own flat, 3 floors up, staring out at the London skyline. He thought of Grace's quiet strength, of Noah's unwavering trust, and he realized something he hadn't let himself feel since the accident that stole Claire from him. He wanted to love again, not because he needed saving, but because this time he wanted to be the one who stayed. Grace had never belonged to soft places, not in the eyes of her parents who cast her out without a second glance, nor in the eyes of the man who had once whispered promises into her hair and vanished the second life stirred in her belly. She had carried her son Noah on her back through the coldest nights, worked nameless jobs behind closed doors, and made meals from scraps that others would have thrown away without thought. And though her body ached and her spirit trembled, she never faltered in one truth. He, that little boy with eyes too old for his age, was worth it all. Now, as she stood in Edward's immaculate kitchen, she felt the full weight of the unfamiliar. There was heat here, quiet, a fridge that hummed instead of groaned, a table that had never known hunger. She didn't know how to be still in a place that didn't demand her sacrifice. That morning, she found a note. Edward had left early for work, but a small envelope lay folded near the kettle. Inside, a handwritten message. Would you consider joining a new outreach initiative at the foundation? You've lived what most of us only read about. You could lead, inspire, rebuild. Let's talk. She read it twice, her hands trembling. Her first instinct was to run, because nothing good ever came without a price. But then she looked at Noah, still asleep in the little bed they now called his own, cheeks flushed, safe. And for the first time, she thought, maybe this isn't a trap. Maybe it's a doorway. They met that evening over tea in the lounge where so many of their cautious conversations had unfolded. Edward didn't pitch her the idea like a businessman. He spoke like someone who had finally started listening to the parts of the world that don't make headlines. He spoke about single mothers like her, about women who'd been abandoned by systems meant to protect them, about hope that was practical, not poetic. And he offered her the keys. Grace said yes. Not because she felt ready, but because deep down she knew what it felt like to sleep on pews and train station benches, to hide bruises with jumpers and pain with silence. If she could build a place where no woman had to do that again, just one, then her scars meant something. The next few weeks moved in waves. Edward supported the paperwork, the legal bits, the space, but the soul of it all came from Grace. She painted the walls in warm tones, filled the kitchen with donated high chairs and mismatched mugs, and insisted every woman be greeted by name, never number. The center opened quietly. No ribbon-cutting ceremony, just a welcome sign and an open door. The women came, some with babies swaddled in blankets too thin, some with eyes that darted toward exits. Grace welcomed each of them like she would a sister. She never asked why they were there, only if they wanted tea. She sat on the floors with toddlers, held hands through panic attacks, helped one woman fill out a benefits form while her toddler played with Noah's old toy cars. Every evening, Edward would stop by, sometimes with paperwork, sometimes with dinner, always with that quiet look, the one that saw everything she was doing and chose not to interrupt it. One night, he stayed a bit longer. The center had emptied. Noah was asleep in the corner, arms curled around a donated teddy. Grace was stacking chairs when Edward stepped beside her. "You make this place feel like a heartbeat," he said softly. She smiled but didn't look at him. "You gave me the walls. I just filled them with something real." He paused, then reached into his coat pocket. "It's not charity," he said, sensing her hesitation. "It's an investment in someone I believe in." He handed her a plain card, just her name, followed by a title, Director, Haven House Outreach. Grace looked at it, then at him, her throat tightening. "No one's ever given me a title before," she whispered. "Only labels." Edward stepped closer. "Well, now you've got both, a name and a purpose." And in that quiet moment among plastic chairs and hope worn thin by time, Grace felt it. Not rescue, not romance, but something deeper. Recognition. She was no longer invisible. The apartment no longer echoed like it did when Grace and Noah first stepped inside. In the beginning, she hadn't unpacked properly, hadn't even dared to hang a coat on the hooks by the door. Everything felt borrowed, breakable, a kindness she wasn't sure she could trust. But now, just a few weeks later, it had changed. Not through money or furniture, but through laughter, warmth, and the kind of everyday chaos that makes a place feel like home. That particular night, Grace sat cross-legged on the living room rug, an old throw blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her long blonde hair loose for the first time in days. Across from her, Noah was a blur of movement and joy. He had turned the entire flat into a kingdom of cushions and was wearing one of Edward's oversized ties as a superhero cape. Grace laughed, properly laughed, as she held up two mismatched socks on her hands and made them speak in silly accents, acting out stories of dragons who baked cakes and robots who were afraid of the dark. It was the first time in years she felt herself breathe without flinching. She didn't hear the door open. Edward had let himself in quietly, expecting a quiet evening check-in, maybe a tired thank you or a polite cup of tea. What he walked into instead was magic. Grace's cheeks were flushed pink from laughter. Her eyes, once dulled by fear and fatigue, now sparkled beneath the soft lamplight. Noah was mid-flight across the couch cushions, giggling uncontrollably as his mom pretended to be a dragon afraid of marmalade. The sound wrapped around Edward like a blanket, familiar, alive, disarming. He didn't speak. He just stood in the doorway, invisible but rooted, watching. Not in pity or pride, but awe. Grace saw him a moment later. She froze, sheepishly lowering the sock puppets. But Edward only smiled, really smiled, before stepping back and closing the door gently behind him. He didn't want to interrupt something that beautiful. Back upstairs, in his own pristine flat just 3 floors up, he leaned against the window pane, heart racing with something he couldn't yet name. There was a life in that little apartment, one that had nothing to do with wealth or decor, and he found himself longing for it, not as a visitor but as part of it. From that night on, things shifted. Grace didn't just live there, she existed there fully. She cooked warm meals, simple ones like lentil stew or fish pie, and left extra portions in the hallway, claiming she accidentally made too much. Edward never challenged the lie. He brought groceries without asking, children's books for Noah, and always knocked first. Noah, too, bloomed. His drawings began covering the fridge. Stick figures of 3 people holding hands under a yellow sun, one in a cape, one with a briefcase, one with wild golden hair. In his bedtime prayers, he thanked the clouds, the blankets, and Mr. Edward's magic bread. And in small, unspoken ways, Grace and Edward grew close. Never in grand gestures, just in cups of tea left steeping, in folded laundry shared between doorways, in soft conversations about childhood and what it means to survive. Grace still held her guard high, but her laughter became easier, her shoulders less tense. One evening, while clearing up after dinner, Edward caught her humming a tune. He looked up. "You sing?" She chuckled. "Not well." He paused. "You laugh beautifully too." Grace froze, then smiled, not the cautious one she gave strangers, but the kind that made her whole face light up. In that moment, without declarations or expectations, something new took root between them. Not charity, not obligation. Just 2 souls finally finding room to breathe. For the first time in years, Grace wasn't simply enduring, she was living. It was a cold morning in early February when Grace found herself standing by the kitchen window, the kettle hissing softly behind her. Outside, a faint layer of frost coated the pavement, glistening like glass in the early sun. She held her mug tight between her hands, not for the tea, but for the warmth. Something had shifted in her again. Not dramatically. Not like the day Edward first found her and Noah shivering beneath a railway arch, but subtly, like a door inside her had cracked open, and now the breeze of possibility was whispering through. She glanced across the room where Noah sat hunched over a cereal bowl, feet swinging beneath the table, humming to himself. He had slept soundly the night before, no crying, no tossing. That alone was a miracle. Grace couldn't remember the last time she'd gone to bed without lying awake, worrying about food or the future. Life hadn't become perfect. The fear hadn't disappeared. but for the first time in years it wasn't swallowing her whole. When Edward knocked gently on the door, she wasn't surprised. He'd started stopping by in the mornings just for a chat before work. Sometimes he brought coffee, sometimes fruit for Noah, and once a tiny cactus in a pot shaped like a teacup. "So it doesn't feel so empty on your windowsill," he'd said awkwardly, as though embarrassed by his own kindness. This morning he had nothing in hand, just that soft look that still caught her off guard. "Morning," he said, eyes flicking to Noah. "I was wondering if you two were free this weekend. There's this small museum tucked away near Borough Market. Quiet but lovely. I thought maybe we could go." Grace hesitated, not because she didn't want to, but because a part of her still didn't believe this life was real, that a man like Edward, a man with clean shoes and steady hands and no agenda, could really want to spend time with her and her son. "You don't have to," she said softly, her voice almost apologetic. "We're fine, really." Edward tilted his head. "I know you are, but that doesn't mean you have to do everything alone." Those words stuck with her long after he left. Later that day, she sat beside Noah as he drew on scrap paper, telling her a story about a tiger who became best friends with a hedgehog. Grace wasn't really listening. Her mind was elsewhere, on Edward, on what it meant to be wanted not out of pity, but because someone saw you, truly saw you. She had built her life around silence, around being invisible enough to survive, but now someone was asking her to be visible again, to belong, and that scared her more than anything. Saturday came, and with it a kind of nervous anticipation. Grace dressed Noah in his best jumper, the one with tiny foxes stitched on the front, and braided his hair carefully. She wore a second-hand coat Edward had given her weeks before, still unsure if it suited her, but knowing it was warm and soft and for once didn't smell like desperation. At the museum, Edward was waiting with 3 tickets in hand and a smile that reached his eyes. They wandered through dusty displays of Victorian toys and vintage postcards. Noah clung to their hands, asking questions about everything. Grace found herself laughing again, easily this time, as Edward read aloud from plaques in a mock theatrical voice, making her son roar with giggles. But it wasn't just Noah who noticed. Somewhere between the exhibit on old steam trains and the war ration kitchen, Grace looked at Edward and realized how different he was. He didn't try to fix her. He didn't look at her like a broken thing. He simply stayed, steady, quiet, present, and that was new. By the time they left, Grace's cheeks ached from smiling. They bought hot chocolates and sat on a bench near the Thames, watching the river ripple beneath the gray sky. Edward glanced over, his voice low. "You know, I've never brought anyone here before, not even friends." Grace turned to him, surprised. "Why not?" He shrugged. "Because no one ever made it feel worth sharing." The words hung between them like fog, and for the first time, Grace didn't pull away. She didn't retreat into old habits or fear. She simply nodded and said, "Thank you for letting us in." Edward smiled, and this time so did she. Not just with her lips, but with her whole heart. Because perhaps, just perhaps, this was what healing looked like. Not fireworks or sudden changes, but slow, steady mornings and warm drinks and the quiet magic of being seen. The sky outside was a soft gray, the kind that whispered of coming rain. Inside the community center Grace now helped manage, the warmth came not from the heaters, but from the people. Toddlers chased each other between tables. A kettle hissed somewhere in the background. The air carried the scent of weak coffee, hand lotion, and hope. Grace moved gracefully between groups of women, some young, some weathered, each with a story not unlike her own. She was no longer just surviving. She was building. Not only a life for herself and Noah, but a space where other women could find refuge, dignity, and a way forward. She hadn't planned on staying this long. When Edward first offered her the guest flat upstairs from his own, she had said just a few days. She'd meant it. But days turned to weeks, weeks into something more. She didn't know exactly when the apartment stopped feeling like a borrowed space and started feeling like a home. But it had, slowly, silently, like most real changes do. At 3 p.m. sharp, the center's front doors burst open and in came Noah, rucksack bouncing, cheeks pink from the crisp afternoon wind. He ran straight into her arms. "Mom," he called, already grinning. "We did painting today at school. I made a lion." He held up a crumpled sheet of paper, a glorious mess of orange and red brushstrokes. Grace crouched to his level and admired it like it was the finest art she'd ever seen. "It's brilliant," she whispered, pulling him close. Edward followed behind, his coat dusted with snowflakes, holding a takeaway cup and a small paper bag. "Hot chocolate for the artist," he smiled, passing it to Noah, who squealed with joy. He then turned to Grace and kissed her cheek, gentle, familiar, no hesitation. That evening, in their modest flat, walls now decorated with Noah's artwork and shelves lined with secondhand books, Grace set the table for dinner. A few of the women from the center joined them, women she'd once shared floor space with in shelters. They brought stories, laughter, homemade biscuits, nothing grand, just enough. After the plates had been cleared and Noah had dragged one guest away to admire his lion lair built of pillows, Edward stood at the head of the table. "I'm not much for speeches," he said, nervous, though his voice was steady. "But I've been thinking about this moment for a long time." He reached into his pocket and drew out a small velvet box. Grace froze. Her breath caught as he opened it. Inside lay a ring, simple, elegant, nothing showy, but full of meaning. Edward knelt on one knee. "You once asked for just 10 pounds, he began. "But what you gave me was so much more. You showed me strength, honesty, and what it means to love without expecting anything back. Let me give something back to you. Not out of guilt, but out of love. Let me build a life with you." The room fell silent. Grace stared at him, eyes wide, heart thundering. She looked at Noah, now peeking from behind a cushioned fort, eyes shining. "Say yes, Mommy," he whispered, unable to contain himself. She laughed through the tears that welled up and spilled over. "Yes," she said softly, then louder. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." Cheers erupted from the room, but Edward saw only her. Later that night, with Noah tucked into bed and the snow falling gently outside, Grace sat with Edward on the sofa, her head on his shoulder, his arm wrapped around her. They said little. They didn't need to. For the first time in years, silence wasn't empty. It was full. They had walked through storms, both real and unseen. They had known what it was to be invisible, to feel forgotten. But now they were building something quiet and fierce, a home, a family, a future. Not perfect, not easy, but theirs. And as the snow blanketed the city outside, Grace realized she wasn't just part of a story that had changed her life. She was helping write new ones. For every woman who walked through that center's doors, she was no longer just surviving. She was leading, healing, becoming. And it all started with a little boy, a pair of scuffed shoes, and a heart willing to hope. Sometimes it takes a child's voice and a mother's quiet strength to thaw even the coldest heart. When Lucas Reed, a powerful CEO, met little Eli, a boy begging not for pity but for a chance to work and buy his mom bread, he didn't just see poverty, he saw courage. And when he followed that boy to a young woman slumped by a planter, pale with hunger but still holding on to her son, he saw what the world too often overlooks, the silent fight of mothers doing everything to protect their children. This story isn't about charity or heroism, it's about dignity. It's about a man realizing that true success isn't found in corner offices or bank accounts, but in choosing to care, to connect, and to honor the strength of others. Grace, formerly invisible to the world, wasn't rescued. She was recognized, and that changed everything. Her resilience, her refusal to be pitied, reminded us that love is an act of daily bravery. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on the people you might have walked past today. Maybe someone just like Grace is still out there, hoping to be seen. Leave a comment below, share your thoughts, your stories, your kindness. And please subscribe to our channel for more stories like this, because together, through shared moments of compassion, we might just make the world